April 27, 1945. A heavy German truck bumps along a winding mountain road near Lake Como. Inside, huddled in the gloom, sits a man in an oversized greatcoat. He pulls a steel helmet low over his eyes. 44 million Italians once obeyed his every command. Now, he is just cargo. He is Benito Mussolini, and he is running for his life. Why did the Duce end up cowering on dirty floorboards? It seemed impossible only months ago, but fear is a powerful motivator. Just hours earlier, he was the dictator of Italy. Now, he was a fugitive. His fate hung by a thread. The goal was the Swiss border. A few miles meant the difference between life and execution. Allied forces pushed relentlessly from the south. Milan had fallen days ago. The puppet state in northern Italy collapsed like a house of cards. German forces were in full retreat. Partisan fighters swarmed the hills. The war was irretrievably lost. The convoy moved slowly. It was a parade of the desperate. In the vehicles, high-ranking SS officers sat shoulder to shoulder with Italian fascist ministers. These men had stayed loyal to the end, but that loyalty now looked like a suicide pact. The camera records the details of a collapse. Wives clutch leather bags filled with gold and stolen jewelry. Children press their faces against the cold glass. Confusion and terror are visible in every pair of eyes. Mussolini had stripped off his medals. He abandoned the fancy uniforms designed to project strength. Instead, he wore a heavy German greatcoat. He hoped the field gray wool would make him invisible. He hoped the helmet would hide the face that everyone in Italy knew. At first glance, a tired conscript, but in reality, the architect of Italian fascism. The irony was brutal. This was the man who lived for the balcony. He loved the roar of the crowd in Rome. He loved the flashbulbs. Now, he shrank away from the light. He hunched his shoulders. He remained silent. He tried to become small, but he was not entirely alone. Clara Petacci traveled in a separate vehicle with other refugees. She had opportunities to run. She had connections, but she refused. She chose to follow the man she had loved for 10 years into the abyss. The road hugged the western shore of Lake Como. The scenery was breathtaking. Elegant villas lined the water. Once, this was the playground of the elite. Now, it was a corridor of death. Reports crackled over the radio. Partisans blocked the mountain passes. Rumors flew through the convoy. The Swiss guards were sealing the gates. Neutrality was over. The Swiss authorities were overwhelmed. They wanted no part of the falling regime. They turned away everyone without diplomatic papers. Mussolini's name was certainly not on the guest list. The danger was physical. Partisan leaflets littered the streets of villages they passed. The radio broadcasts were clear. Death to the hierarchy. There would be no trials. There would be no negotiations. The German escorts grew restless. They looked at their watches. They looked at their weapons. Loyalty to Italy was gone. Sound of the engine straining against the incline. Inside the truck, the air smelled of diesel and sweat. The German officers whispered among themselves. They had families in Germany. The Third Reich was burning. Hitler was trapped in his bunker in Berlin. These men were soldiers, not martyrs. If handing over Mussolini meant survival, they would do it. But events accelerated. It was midday. The sun beat down on the metal roofs of the trucks. Suddenly, the brakes screeched. The convoy ground to a halt. Ahead lay the village of Dongo. A wooden barrier blocked the road. Men with red scarves and rifles stood waiting. The trap snapped shut. April 27, 1945. The end began at a simple roadblock on a mountain pass. The checkpoint near the village of Dongo was a crude barrier of logs and stone. It was controlled by the 52nd Garibaldi Brigade. These men were not elite commandos. They were farmers with calloused hands, factory workers covered in grease, and university students who had traded textbooks for submachine guns. They wore mismatched uniforms and carried stolen rifles, but they were united by something stronger than discipline. Why were they there? It wasn't just duty. It was hatred. The regime had burned their villages. It had tortured their fathers in secret police basements. Every man at that barricade had a score to settle. They had been fighting in these mountains for months, waiting for a chance to strike back. A column of heavy trucks rumbled up the winding road, the engines strained against the incline. At first glance, a standard German retreat, but in reality, a desperate escape. The partisans lowered their weapons slightly. German military vehicles were a common sight. The resistance had strict orders: let the Wehrmacht pass, but stop the blackshirts. They wanted Italian fascists, not a firefight with a mechanized German unit. But Urbano Lazzaro froze. Lazzaro was a partisan leader with a sharp eye for detail. He had served in the army before the collapse. He watched the soldiers sitting in the back of the transport trucks. Something was wrong. The uniforms hung loosely on their frames. The men were sweating profusely, despite the biting chill of the mountain air. Their body language was not disciplined, it was terrified. Lazzaro had received a radio transmission just hours before. Intelligence warned that high-value targets were trying to flee north. He signaled his men. The barrier remained down. Lazzaro ordered a full inspection. Partisans surrounded the convoy. They approached each truck with fingers on triggers. They demanded identification papers. They asked pointed questions in Italian and German. The real German officers barked replies with mechanical precision. They showed stamped passes and stared straight ahead. But the disguised Italians began to crack. There was no turning back. Tension spiked. One German soldier fumbled with his ID. His hands shook violently. The papers slipped from his grip and scattered across the asphalt. A partisan picked them up. Italian identity cards lay mixed with German passes. Another man tried to hide his face behind a bandage. He claimed a war wound. A local fighter stepped closer and ripped the bandage away. He knew that face. He knew the scar beneath the gauze. It was a fascist official known for torturing civilians in the valley. The charade collapsed, but the biggest prize was still hiding. In the corner of one truck sat a slumped figure. He wore an oversized German helmet and a thick coat that swallowed his frame. Giuseppe Negri, a young partisan, climbed onto the wheel well and peered into the truck. He knew the jawline, he knew the eyes. Every school wall in Italy had carried this man's portrait for 20 years. Negri whispered the name that stopped everyone's heart: Il Duce. The news hit the checkpoint like a physical blow. The fighters who had dreamed of this moment for years suddenly found themselves looking at the face of their nightmare. Mussolini stood up. He realized the disguise had failed. For a split second, he tried to inflate his chest. He attempted to summon the theatrical power that had once hypnotized millions from the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia. He tried to look like a leader, but the camera records, a tired, frightened old man shivering in a coat that didn't fit. The magic was dead. The gestures that once inspired awe now looked pathetic. There was no dictator here, only a fugitive. The reaction was instant. Dozens of rifle barrels swung toward the truck. The sound of bolts racking echoed off the valley walls. Colonel Hans Fallmeyer, the German commander, made a cold calculation. He stepped away from the truck. He produced papers proving his unit was regular army. He claimed the Italians were merely hitchhikers. The alliance was over. The Germans abandoned their former idol to save themselves. The partisans dragged the rest of the entourage from the vehicles. Clara Petacci, the dictator's mistress, was pulled from another car. She clung to him, hysterical. But it didn't matter. The 52nd Brigade had captured the head of the snake. Word flew through the mountains. Couriers ran through the forests to reach hidden outposts. Radio operators tapped out the code: Mussolini is taken. Resistance leaders across the north froze in disbelief. They had the prize. But now they had a problem. The most hated man in Italy was alive in their custody. The war was ending, but the danger was spiking. Thus ended the hunt. April 27th. Darkness swallowed the small village of Bonzanigo. Benito Mussolini found himself trapped in a farmhouse, a rough structure with peeling paint and cold drafts. The man who had once held the fate of millions in his fist now faced the longest, most powerless night of his life. The room was cramped. It smelled of damp wood, unwashed wool, and old stone. Just days ago, Mussolini walked the marble halls of the Villa Torlonia in Rome, surrounded by servants and tapestries. Now, the Prime Minister sat on a rickety chair in a peasant's home. The contrast was sharp. The rough walls of the farmhouse seemed to close in on him. Why did the partisans choose this specific house? It seemed like a random choice, but the location was calculated. It was remote enough to hide the prisoner from desperate German patrols. Yet, it was close enough to the partisan command for rapid orders. The owners were a simple local family. They had suffered under the fascist regime. They had lost sons to the dictator's wars. Now, they guarded the man responsible for their grief. The guards stood by the door. These were not soldiers in polished uniforms. They were factory workers and farmers with grease under their fingernails and Sten guns in their hands. They viewed the prisoner not as a fallen head of state, but as a criminal. They rotated shifts every few hours. They kept their fingers near the triggers. The footage of history records a pathetic sight. Mussolini could not sit still. He paced the small room, 4 steps forward, 4 steps back. His heavy coat dragged on the floor. At first glance, he tried to maintain the posture of Il Duce, but in reality, he was a trembling old man. He spoke to the guards. He did not beg. He bargained. He reminded them of the roads he built. He spoke of Italian glory and the empire he expanded. When that failed, his voice dropped. He offered gold. He offered the names of other high-ranking fascists hiding in the mountains. He promised them wealth if they let him walk out the door. But the partisans did not blink. They stared at him with cold, hard eyes. They did not want his gold. They remembered the blackened ruins of their villages. They remembered the public executions in the town squares. Every word Mussolini spoke hit a wall of silence. The tension in the room was suffocating. The click of a safety catch being checked echoed in the quiet house. There was no negotiation here. Beside him sat Clara Petacci. She was 29 years old. She had every chance to run, to disappear into the Swiss Alps. Instead, she stayed. Her loyalty was absolute. In the frame, a woman in a fur coat shivering not just from the cold, but from terror. She held Mussolini's arm. She whispered into his ear, trying to calm the man who once shouted from balconies to roaring crowds. Outside the door, a quiet debate raged. The partisans whispered among themselves. Was she a criminal? Or was she just a mistress, caught in the gears of history? Some wanted to let her go. Others argued that her silence over the years made her an accomplice. She had enjoyed the palaces and the protection. Now she shared the cage. Inside, the hours dragged on. Petacci smoothed her dress. She looked at the dirty floor, remembering the gala dinners and the flash of cameras. Those days were gone. The windows were shuttered. The world outside had stopped. Only the breathing of the guards and the ticking of a watch remained. The night was ending, and with the sunrise, judgment was coming. April 28, 1945. The dawn brought a problem of massive scale. Urgent messages flew between partisan commanders across the entire region. Couriers sprinted through the darkness, radios crackled with coded signals. The resistance had achieved the impossible. They had the man who led Italy into the abyss. Mussolini was alive, he was in custody. But possessing the dictator was a logistical nightmare. Why was this a crisis? The Allies were only miles away. If the Americans arrived first, they would take Mussolini into international custody. The partisans could not accept that outcome. A fierce debate erupted in the smoke-filled command posts. It was not just a military discussion. It was a battle for the soul of the future nation. One faction argued for a public trial. They wanted a courtroom. They wanted judges. They wanted the crimes of the regime read aloud into the record. This approach promised legitimacy. It would prove to the world that the resistance was a government of law, not a mob seeking revenge. But the opposing faction saw only danger. Every minute of delay was a gamble. Fascist loyalists were still armed and dangerous. A rescue mission could launch at any moment. The partisans remembered how Hitler had snatched Mussolini from captivity once before. At first glance, a debate about justice, but in reality, a race against the clock. The hardliners demanded immediate action. To them, execution was not murder. It was a revolutionary necessity. It was the only way to ensure the dictator never returned to power. The practical reality of war overshadowed the theory of law. But this was only the beginning of the collapse. As the night wore on, the reports kept coming. The net was closing across the entire north. The resistance had swept up the entire hierarchy of the falling regime. Alessandro Pavolini, the fanatical architect of the puppet republic, was dragged from a vehicle near Bergamo. Achille Storazzi, the brutal party secretary, was captured near Como. The footage from this period shows the reality: powerful men reduced to prisoners in the back of civilian trucks. The government of the Social Republic had ceased to exist. In his temporary cell, Mussolini seemed to sense the walls closing in. The guards watched him closely. According to their accounts, the former Duce vacillated between arrogance and despair. One moment, he stood tall. He lectured his captors. He insisted that history would vindicate his decisions and restore Italy's greatness. Then, the mood shifted. He slumped in his chair. He spoke of the human cost of the war. He mentioned the suffering of the people. But mostly, he spoke of his family. He asked about his children. He worried for Vittorio, his son and propagandist. He spoke of Etta, his daughter, the widow of the man Mussolini had executed for treason. The personal wreckage of his political life weighed heavy in the room. The camera records, a tired old man in a militia uniform waiting for a verdict. But philosophical reflection was pointless. While Mussolini worried about his legacy, the partisan leadership made their choice. The arguments in the command center ceased. There would be no courtroom. There would be no long testimony. The decision was final. The sun rose over the mountains. The debate was over. The executioners prepared their weapons. April 28, 1945. Dawn broke over the mountains, bringing with it a sentence of death. The partisan commanders had not slept. They spent the night in smoke-filled rooms, arguing, planning, and weighing the risks. By morning, the verdict was absolute. There would be no courtroom drama, no lawyers, no transfer to the advancing Allied forces. The risk was too high. Mussolini could not be allowed to become a martyr or a rallying point for surviving fascists. The executioner was already chosen. His name was Walter Audizio, a communist partisan commander operating under the codename Colonel Valerio. Audizio was not just a soldier following orders. He was a man driven by memory. He had fought fascism since the resistance began. He had buried friends. He had seen comrades tortured. For him, this mission was not a military checkbox. It was personal justice. He gathered his gear, checked his weapon, and moved out. He arrived at the farmhouse in Bonzanigo with a small, heavily armed team. The orders from the National Liberation Committee were clear. There was no room for hesitation. The war was still raging on the plains below. American tanks were closing in. The partisans knew they had a narrow window to act. Why did they rush the execution? A trial would take months. The Allies might show leniency. But the resistance wanted a final, irreversible end to the regime. Audizio entered the room. Mussolini and Clara Petacci were waiting. The former dictator looked up, and the reality of the situation hit him like a physical blow. Audizio did not waste words. He stood tall and informed Mussolini that he had been condemned to death for crimes against the Italian people. The reaction was immediate. Mussolini did not accept his fate with stoicism. He panicked. He began to negotiate. He spoke fast, his voice rising in desperation. He offered secrets. He promised the locations of the hidden fascist gold reserves. He swore to give up the names of fleeing officials. Just days ago, this man commanded armies. Now, he was trading state secrets for a few more hours of breath, but Audizio stood like a stone. He was unmoved by the bribes. He had heard enough. This was a court of revolutionary justice, and the sentence was final. At first glance, a simple prisoner transfer. But in reality, a funeral procession. Clara Petacci stood nearby, paralyzed. Her fate was sealed by her proximity to power. She held no official rank. She commanded no troops. But in the eyes of the partisans, she was a symbol. Her luxury had come at the cost of Italian suffering. Her pleas for mercy bounced off the walls. The men in that room had seen too much cruelty to feel pity now. Events accelerated. Audizio ordered his men to move. The preparation was brutal and efficient. They grabbed the prisoners and shoved them into a waiting vehicle. The engine roared to life. The convoy began the short drive to a location that history would never forget. The trip lasted only minutes, but it marked the final transition. Mussolini sat in the back, silent. The bargaining was over. He looked out at the narrow mountain roads near Lake Como. 23 years of absolute power were dissolving into the asphalt behind him. He wasn't going to Rome or a grand palace. He was going to an anonymous village. 4:10 in the afternoon. The vehicle screeched to a halt. They arrived at Villa Belmonte in Giulino di Mezzagra. The location was specific. It was a quiet residential area, a secluded spot where gunfire wouldn't cause a panic on the main roads. Audizio opened the door and ordered them out. He positioned Mussolini and Petacci against the villa's iron gate. The visual suggestion is striking. A modest suburban street, well-kept gardens, a stone wall. It looked like a place for a Sunday walk, not an execution. Witnesses later described the dictator's final moments. He shifted his weight. He tried to stand straight, attempting to summon the arrogance of the past. He puffed out his chest, but the facade cracked. His hands trembled uncontrollably. Fear was visible in his eyes. Petacci was in a daze. She seemed unable to process the scene. She tried to speak, perhaps to beg one last time, but Audizio raised his voice. He cut off the farewells. He had a schedule to keep. The end was swift. Audizio raised his weapon. He fired multiple shots at point-blank range. The cracks of the gunfire echoed off the villa walls. Mussolini collapsed instantly. Petacci fell beside him. The man who had shaped the destiny of millions was dead in seconds. There were no famous last words, no speeches, no Roman salute, just a body on the gravel. Audizio moved quickly. He checked for a pulse. He confirmed the kill. Then he barked orders to his men. They lifted the bodies and threw them into the back of the vehicle. The mission was not over. The plan required a public display. They had to transport the corpses to Milan. The partisans understood the psychology of the people. Italians needed to see the body. They needed visual proof that the monster was truly dead. The vehicle sped away from Giulino di Mezzagra. Behind them, they left only bloodstains on the dirt. The next rain would wash them away. The villa returned to silence. The journey to Milan took hours, but the signal traveled faster. Partisan radio networks buzzed with the news. Il Duce is gone. By evening, every resistance fighter in the north knew the truth. The general population would wake up to a new world. The car drove on into the night, thus ended an era. April 29, 1945. Dawn broke over Milan. In Piazzale Loreto, the stage was set before the city woke up. The bodies of Benito Mussolini, Clara Petacci, and the fascist hierarchy lay on the pavement. They were not arranged with honor. They were dumped like cargo. Word of the display did not just spread. It exploded through the neighborhoods like a shockwave. Why did the crowds react with such ferocity? It seemed like sudden madness, but the pressure had been building for over 2 decades. Italians had suffocated under the regime's boot. They had buried sons killed in useless wars. They had endured hunger, bombings, and silence. Now they saw the concrete symbol of their suffering lying in the dirt. The era of the untouchable dictator was over. The crowds that flooded Piazzale Loreto represented every fracture of Italian society. The footage shows a chaotic surge of humanity. Thousands pressed into the square. They broke through the lines. Everyone wanted to verify the truth. Some stood in stunned silence, unable to process the sight. Others could not contain their rage. Men kicked the lifeless bodies. Women spat on the faces of the fallen leaders. It was raw, physical verification that fascism was dead. But this was only the beginning. The display served a function beyond simple revenge. For the partisan movement, it was a receipt for their victory. The mission to decapitate the regime was complete. For the common citizen, it was psychological liberation. They saw that the man they were forced to worship was just flesh and bone. He was mortal. The myth evaporated in the morning light. The crowd's behavior reflected the tangled history of the nation. Some of those screaming in the square had once cheered Mussolini in the 1920s. They had supported the imperial conquests in Ethiopia. They had celebrated the early years of World War II. Now, faced with the ruin of their country, the mood shifted. Shame mixed with relief. Angry satisfaction replaced blind loyalty. At first glance, a spontaneous riot. But in reality, a calculated act of poetic justice. The location was chosen with cold precision. Months earlier, fascist squads had executed 15 partisans on this very spot. They had left the bodies on the stones as a warning to the resistance. Now, the tables turned. The corpses of the oppressors replaced the victims. The square witnessed the reversal of brutality. International journalists arrived to document the finale. The camera records, reporters scribbling furiously while photographers climbed for better angles. These images were not just news, they were historical evidence. They were wired across the globe, proving that another Axis leader had met his end. For Allied troops fighting on other fronts, the photos were powerful propaganda. They signaled that victory was not just possible, it was inevitable. Events accelerated, the morning wore on. The crowds did not disperse. People traveled from the surrounding countryside, turning the square into a grim pilgrimage site. They needed to see the end of the nightmare with their own eyes. But the situation grew dangerous. The anger in the square threatened to spiral out of control. Allied commanders and Italian authorities watched the tension rise. The spectacle had served its purpose, but order had to be restored. By late afternoon, the order came. Allied soldiers entered the square on April 29th. They cleared the area. The bodies were removed and taken to unmarked graves. The physical show ended there. But the impact of those 24 hours did not fade. It echoed through Italian society for decades. Thus ended an era. April 28, 1945. On this date, the shots rang out, but the echoes would last for decades. The death of Benito Mussolini immediately split public opinion into two sharp factions. Arguments erupted before the body was even cold. Some saw the partisan volley as necessary rough justice. A dictator who had ordered thousands of executions deserved no mercy. Blood for blood. Why didn't they wait for a judge? The Allies wanted a courtroom drama. A tribunal would have documented every fascist crime for the history books, but the partisans ignored the protocols. At first glance, a chaotic murder. But in reality, a calculated final strike. The commanders in northern Italy did not care about legal precedents. They cared about finality. They feared a rescue attempt. They feared a political escape. The timeline was brutally fast. April 27th, capture. April 28th, execution. April 29th, the public display. There was no pause for breath. The war in the north was ending in a spasm of violence, and decisions were made in seconds, not months. For the Italian resistance, this was not a crime. It was the mission objective. They had proved a vital point. A deeply entrenched totalitarian regime could be dismantled by ordinary citizens. The network of spies and fighters in the mountains had won. This victory sent a shockwave across Europe. Resistance cells in other occupied nations took note. If the Duce could fall, anyone could fall. But this was only the beginning. International reactions poured in via telegram and radio. Winston Churchill did not hide his satisfaction. One of the British Empire's greatest threats was removed from the board. In Washington, American officials checked their maps. Mussolini's death was a clear signal the European front was collapsing. The end was days away. Inside Italy, the mood was different. The execution marked ground zero for national reconstruction. The footage shows cities reduced to skeletons of brick and iron. Bridges are in the river, roads are cratered. The task was colossal. It wasn't just about pouring concrete or laying rail lines. The rot went deeper. The partisans and the new government had to purge the courts. They had to cleanse the police stations. 20 years of authoritarian rule had poisoned the social water supply. Healing would take generations. The final 24 hours of Mussolini's life cast a long shadow. The image of the corpse hanging in Piazzale Loreto became more than a gruesome photo. It became a historic marker. It was a warning to future tyrants. It was proof that power is temporary. The location of the shooting, Giuliano di Mezzegra, transformed as well. It became a site of memory. Visitors arrive there today. They do not come to honor the man. They come to stand where the regime physically ended. They come to remember the courage of the shopkeepers and farmers who pulled the trigger. Events accelerated. The collapse was total. The man who dreamed of a new Roman Empire ended his life in a panicked run. He tried to cross the border. He wore a German soldier's greatcoat. He hid in the back of a truck. There were no balconies, no cheering crowds, no black shirts marching in unison. In the end, he was stripped of his titles and his pretenses. He was not Il Duce. He was a frightened old man in a borrowed coat. He faced the wall. He faced the consequences of his own ambition. And then, everything went dark. Thus ended the era of Italian fascism.